The sun over the New Mexico territory did not warm. It punished. It beat down on the warped wooden roof of the mercantile, baking the air inside, until it smelled of dry tobacco-oiled canvas and stale desperation. Cora sat on a splintered pine bench near the back, perfectly still. She wore a faded gray dress, the hem coated in the fine, pale alkali dust that covered everything in this forgotten edge of the world. In her lap, her hands rested over a small canvas satchel. It held a comb, 2 changes of undergarments, and a Bible with her father's name pressed into the worn leather. It was everything she owned in the world. The town of Bitter Creek had made its verdict clear when her father was put in the ground 3 days ago. The debts were too high. The bank took the farm. The boarding house wanted money she did not have. Survival out here was a ruthless arithmetic, and Cora's ledger was empty. The bell above the mercantile door let out a flat, dull clank. The heavy wooden door pushed open, and the suffocating heat of the afternoon rolled into the shadows of the store. With it came a man. The low hum of conversation from the 2 men at the counter died instantly. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and immediate. Cora lifted her chin, her eyes adjusting to the glare of the open doorway. He stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind him. He was Apache. Tall, broad across the shoulders, and built with the dense, quiet stillness of a mountain cedar. He wore faded denim trousers tucked into knee-high moccasins, coated in the same pale dust as Cora's dress. A canvas duster hung open over a simple linen shirt. Silver conchos gleamed faintly at his belt. He did not swagger. He simply occupied the space, his presence commanding the room without a single word. He walked to the counter. The floorboards did not seem to creak beneath his weight. The storekeeper, a nervous man with sweat beading on his upper lip, swallowed hard but said nothing. The Apache placed a list on the counter written on a scrap of brown paper. Next to it, he set down 3 heavy silver
Your
coins.
hands tell the story of your
The
hard
dull
work.
clink of the
Every
metal
callus,
was the only
every red
sound in the
knuckle, a
room.
mark of your strength and resilience.
Flour,
I see the effort
coffee,
in every line and scar.
salt,
Thank you for all you do.
nails, the Apache said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder rolling over the plains. It carried an accent slow and deliberate, each word chosen with purpose. The storekeeper hurried to fill the order, eager to be done. Cora watched the Apache. He did not watch the merchant. He turned his head, his dark, unreadable eyes sweeping the
The
shadows
winter
of
will
the
be
room.
harsh. We need to
They
prepare.
settled on her.
The land provides,
Cora did
but
not
we
look
must be
away.
wise.
She had nothing left to
Your
lose,
knowledge
and
is our
pride was the
hope.
only thing the bank
Together,
had not taken.
we endure.
She met his gaze. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and deep bronze weathered by wind and sun. There was a scar cutting through the line of his left eyebrow, but his eyes were steady. They were not cruel. They were entirely practical. He looked at her faded dress. He looked at the canvas satchel in her lap. Finally, his eyes moved to her hands. They were resting on the rough fabric of her skirt. They were not the soft, pale hands of a town lady. They were red at the knuckles, calloused from chopping wood, hauling water, and breaking earth. He turned back to the counter, gathering his supplies into a large burlap sack. He hoisted the heavy sack over one shoulder with effortless grace. Then, instead of walking out the door, he walked toward the back of the store. He stopped 4 feet from her bench. The scent of him reached her wood smoke leather and the crisp, clean scent of crushed sage. "You are waiting for the stagecoach," he said. It was not a question. "The stage does not come until Thursday," Cora replied, her voice steady, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "And I do not have the fare." The Apache absorbed this information with a slow blink. "You have no family in this place?" "I have no family anywhere," Cora said. She kept her spine straight. She would not beg, and she would not weep. He looked toward the window, out at the blinding white dust of the street. "I have a valley. 3 days' ride into the high country. There is water, there is a cabin. I have cattle, and I must hunt." He turned his dark eyes back to hers. "When I am gone, the fire goes cold. The foxes take the chickens. The garden dies. A man cannot build a life with only 2 hands." Cora stared at him. The air between them felt charged, crackling with the weight of unspoken realities. He was not speaking of romance. He was speaking of survival. He was offering a wall against the winter and asking for a foundation in return. "You are looking for a wife," Cora said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am looking for a partner," he corrected smoothly. "A keeper of the hearth. I will provide the meat. I will keep the dangers away. You will keep the home." Cora looked down at her calloused hands. She thought of the cold, judging eyes of the townswomen. She thought of the empty road leading nowhere. Then she looked up at the man standing before her. He was a stranger from a world she did not know, but in his eyes she saw the one thing she desperately needed: a fair bargain. "My name is Cora," she said. "I am Taza," he replied. Cora stood up, her grip tightening on her canvas satchel. "Do you have a horse for me, Taza?" Taza gave a single slow nod. "It is outside." He did not offer his hand, and she did not expect it. He turned and walked toward the door. Cora followed him out of the shadows, stepping away from the only life she had ever known and into the blinding absolute heat of the frontier. Chapter 2. Main idea: the long ride to silence. Target word. Count 900 words. The trail climbed upward, leaving the baked flatlands behind. For 3 days, the only sound was the steady rhythmic crunch of horse hooves against loose shale and the dry whistle of the wind through the canyon walls. They rode in a profound, heavy silence. It was not the silence of anger. It was not the silence of shy hesitation. It was the silence of the frontier, vast, indifferent, and absolute. Cora sat straight in the saddle of the roan mare Taza had provided. Her muscles burned with a deep, relentless ache. The pale alkali dust of the desert slowly gave way to the sharp, bitter tang of sagebrush, and finally to the crisp, thin air of the high timber. With every passing mile, the cruel town of Bitter Creek faded, becoming nothing more than a ghost in the rear view of her mind. She did not look back. There was nothing to look back at. Ahead of her, Taza rode with a fluid, effortless grace. He seemed carved from the very landscape they moved through, an extension of the rugged earth. He did not speak to offer empty comforts. He did not ask if she was tired. He simply led the way, setting a grueling, steady pace that devoured the miles. But in the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and the mountain cold slammed down like a falling iron gate, his actions spoke the words his tongue would not. He would build the fire quickly, his large scarred hands striking flint with practiced ease. The sharp crack of dry cedar catching flame was their evening bell. He would step close, offering her a blackened tin cup of coffee, boiling hot and dark as pitch. Their fingers never touched, but the brutal heat radiating from the rusted metal soaked into her frozen bones. He would unroll the thickest wool blanket for her, taking the thinner canvas for himself, and he would take the first watch, facing the darkness. Cora understood the language he was speaking. It was the language of provision. It was the language of protection. On the afternoon of the third day, the canyon walls narrowed, pinching the trail until they were riding single file in deep, cool shadow. Then the rock walls broke open. Cora pulled back on the reins. Below them lay a hidden valley shaped like a deep emerald bowl. A ribbon of clear, fast-moving water cut through the center, catching the late afternoon light like scattered diamonds. Tall stands of ponderosa pine guarded the edges, their dark green needles swaying in the mountain breeze. It was wild. It was beautiful. It was terrifyingly isolated. In the center of the valley, sitting on a slight rise above the creek, was the cabin. It was built of thick, unpeeled logs chinked with pale, dry mud. A heavy stone chimney leaned slightly against the western wall. There were no flowers near the steps. There was no welcoming whitewash. It was a fortress against the elements, built by a man who only needed a place to sleep and a solid roof to keep the snow off his gear. Taza rode down the slope and Cora followed. When they reached the dooryard, Taza dismounted in one fluid motion. He tied his horse to a hitching post worn smooth by years of use, then stepped back, waiting. He did not reach up to help her down. He allowed her the dignity of dismounting on her own, though her legs trembled violently as her leather boots hit the packed earth. She stood before the heavy plank door. This was her bargain. This was the sum total of her future. She pushed the rough wood and the door opened with a heavy groan. The air inside was stale, smelling intensely of cold ash-cured leather and dry dust. The floor was rough-hewn timber coated in a thick layer of fine mountain dirt. A heavy cast-iron stove sat in the corner, cold and black. A simple wooden table and a single sturdy chair occupied the center of the room. In the far corner, a bed frame built of stripped saplings held a flat ticking mattress. The windows were small, covered by heavy shutters, designed to keep the winter wind out, rather than let the sunlight in.
Rest now, you're
It was stark.
Don't leave me.
It was entirely
Never.
devoid of
I'm right
softness.
here.
Cora stepped over the threshold. She set her canvas satchel on the heavy wooden table. The dull thud echoed in the small, quiet space. She did not cry. She did not let out a heavy sigh. She looked at the cold iron stove. She looked at the dusty floorboards. Then her eyes scanned the shadows near the door, finding what she was looking for: a crude broom fashioned from bound willow twigs. Taza stood in the doorway, a heavy burlap sack of flour hoisted onto his broad shoulder. He stopped blocking the square of sunlight. He watched her. Cora picked up the broom. She turned her back to the open door, turning her back on the vast, intimidating wilderness, and faced the darkest corner of the cabin. She began to sweep. The rhythmic swish-scratch of the willow twigs against the rough floorboards filled the room. It was a small sound, a domestic sound. But in the heavy, ancient silence of the mountain cabin, it sounded like a declaration. She swept the dust toward the door. Taza stepped back, allowing the cloud of dirt to drift out into the crisp mountain air. He watched the rigid set of her shoulders, the steady rhythmic motion of her arms. He saw the grim, unbroken determination in the line of her jaw. She was not a fragile thing to be broken by the quiet. She was a root digging deep into hard soil. Taza lowered the heavy sack to the porch with a soft thud. He did not smile, but the hard lines around his mouth softened just a fraction. He turned away from the door and walked toward the wood pile. She was tending to the hearth. He needed to bring the wood. The bargain had begun. Underscore, 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 underscore. The rhythm of the valley did not care for the fragile feelings of the people living within it. It demanded labor, and it demanded it daily. As the sharp, biting chill of late autumn crept down the canyon walls, the green of the pines deepened, and the aspens turned a violent, shivering gold. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence remained, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the empty, hollow silence of isolation. It had become the comfortable working silence of a shared machine. Cora rose before the
Your hands
sun.
tell the story of your
The
hard
rough
work.
pine
Every
floorboards were
callus, every
freezing
red
against her
knuckle,
bare
a mark
feet,
of your strength and
but she did not
resilience.
hesitate.
I see the effort in
She
every
crossed the
line and
dark
scar.
room, stirring the
Thank
banked
you for all
coals
you
in
do.
the iron stove, feeding them curled shavings of dry cedar until the fire caught with a soft, hungry crackle. By the time Taza sat up on his canvas cot near the door, the heavy scent of boiling coffee and rendering bacon fat filled the small space. They did not say good morning. They did not need to. He would step out into the frost-heavy air, his breath pluming in the gray light to tend the horses and the small flock of winter-hardy sheep. When he returned, a tin plate of food would be waiting at his place on the table. In return, Cora found the wood box perpetually full. The heavy iron buckets of water she used for washing were never empty. Whenever a tool handle cracked, she would find it the next morning, bound tight with wet rawhide that dried into an iron-hard grip. Their language was spoken in the heavy thud of the splitting axe, the scrape of the cast iron skillet, and the quiet hiss of a mending needle pulled through thick denim. It was on a Tuesday when the sky bruised a deep, unnatural purple that the rhythm broke. The wind had died completely. The stillness in the valley was heavy, pressing down on the cabin like a physical weight. Cora was at the table using the last of the fading daylight to sort dried beans. Taza sat near the hearth, carefully oiling the mechanism of his Winchester repeating rifle. The fire popped a loud, sharp sound in the quiet room. Then came the scream. It was a terrible, tearing sound rising from the corral down by the creek. It was the frantic, high-pitched whinny of the roan mare, followed instantly by the terrified bleating of the sheep. Taza was on his feet before the echo died. He did not shout a command. He simply levered a shell into the chamber of the rifle, the metallic clack cutting through the tension, and threw open the heavy plank door. The bitter cold rushed in. Cora did not freeze. The frontier did not tolerate hesitation. She dropped the beans, her hands moving with pure, unthinking instinct. She grabbed the heavy brass lantern from the hook by the door, struck a match against the stone chimney, and lit the wick. With her other hand, she pulled the heavy double-barreled shotgun from its resting place above the lintel. She ran out into the freezing dusk, the lantern throwing wild, swinging shadows across the packed earth of the dooryard. Down by the corral, the shadows were chaotic. The horses were slamming their heavy bodies against the split-rail fence, their hooves kicking up clods of frozen mud. Taza stood at the edge of the enclosure. His rifle raised his body a rigid line of focused tension. "Bring the light," he ordered, his voice low, cutting through the panic of the animals. Cora did not ask where. She moved to his left, stepping up onto the lower rail of the fence, and hoisted the lantern high above her head. The pool of yellow light spilled over the corral, pushing back the encroaching night. In the center of the enclosure, crouched low to the frost-covered earth, was a mountain lion. It was massive, a taut coil of tawny muscle and starving desperation. Its ears were pinned flat against its skull, its pale eyes glowing in the lantern light as it stalked toward the trembling sheep huddled in the corner. The light hit the cat and it froze its head, snapping toward the sudden glare. It let out a low, vibrating snarl that Cora felt in the center of her chest. It was the opening Taza needed. The cat's hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough. The Winchester cracked a deafening explosion of sound and white smoke in the twilight. The big cat shrieked a sound of fury and pain, twisting violently in the dirt. It had not been a fatal shot, the fading light throwing off the angle, but it was enough to break the hunt. The lion scrambled upward, a blur of motion, clearing the far side of the corral fence, in one massive, desperate leap, disappearing into the black timber of the canyon. The echo of the gunshot rolled down the valley, slowly fading into nothing. The horses continued to pace their sides, heaving, but the immediate sharp terror was gone. The heavy metallic smell of cordite hung thick in the cold air, mixing with the scent of frightened animals and damp earth. Taza lowered the rifle. He stood perfectly still, listening to the darkness, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Then slowly he turned his head. He looked at Cora. She was still standing on the lower rail of the fence. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the shotgun, and her breath was coming in short, visible gasps. But the lantern in her other hand was raised high, and it was perfectly, completely steady. She had not screamed. She had not run back to the false safety of the cabin. When the dark had come for them, she had brought the fire. In the yellow flickering light, Taza's dark eyes locked onto hers. The stoic, impenetrable mask he wore against the world slipped just for a fraction of a second. The look he gave her was not the calculating assessment of a man who had made a practical bargain. It was the unguarded, profound respect of a warrior recognizing an equal. He gave a single slow nod. Cora lowered the lantern, the tension slowly draining from her shoulders. She met his gaze, the cold wind whipping a stray strand of hair across her face. They stood there in the freezing mud, bound by the fading smell of gunpowder and the shared survival of the night. "The cold is coming," Taza said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "We should go inside." They walked back to the cabin side by side. The distance between them had not closed, but the ground they walked on had forever changed. Winter did not announce itself. It simply arrived and swallowed the valley whole. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, heavy and low, pressing down on the pines until their branches scraped the frozen earth. Then came the snow. Not the gentle drifting flakes of a soft winter, but a blinding sideways assault of ice that rattled against the heavy wooden shutters like scattered buckshot. The wind screamed down the canyon, a hollow tearing sound that made the thick log walls of the cabin groan in deep protest. Their world, once a sprawling expanse of timber and creek, shrank instantly to the 20 square feet radiating from the cast iron stove. For 3 days they existed in a twilight of howling white. Taza fought his way to the lean-to to feed the stock, plunging through waist-deep drifts, returning crusted in ice, his breathing labored. Cora kept the fire, burning her hands, perpetually smelling of wood smoke and dried sage. But the damp, suffocating cold of the drafty cabin was insidious. It seeped up through the floorboards, bypassing the wool and the leather, settling directly into the bones. On the fourth evening, the rhythm of their shared silence broke. Cora dropped a tin cup. The clatter was violently loud in the small room. She bent to retrieve it, but her hands were trembling. A deep, bone-rattling shiver took hold of her shoulders. She did not complain. She simply pulled her worn wool shawl tighter, her face pale as the snow piled against the door, her eyes bright with a sudden unnatural heat. Taza watched her from across the small wooden table. He saw the shallow, rapid rise and fall of her chest. He saw the fine sheen of sweat gathering at her hairline. He did not ask if she was well. The frontier had no use for obvious questions. He stood up. He walked to the bed of stripped saplings in the corner, pulled back the heavy wool blankets, and turned to her.
Cold, my head
"Lie
hurts."
down," he said. The
Rest
low
now,
rumbling
you're safe.
command left no
Don't
room
leave
for
me.
argument.
Never.
Cora tried
I'm
to
right
stand
here.
her fierce pride, warring with the crushing weight filling her lungs. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the rough timber floor, Taza was there. He caught her with the steady, unyielding strength of a canyon wall. His large hands, rough with calluses and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, wrapped securely around her waist. He lifted her easily, carrying her to the narrow bed. The fever spiked in the darkest, coldest hours of the night. The wind shrieked outside, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. But inside, the only sound was Cora's ragged fighting breath. She tossed under the heavy blankets, trapped in a burning delirium. Taza did not sleep. He pulled his wooden chair to the edge of the bed and became a quiet sentinel against the dark. From a small leather pouch tied at his belt, he drew dried willow bark and bitter roots gathered from the high summer passes. He crushed them with the heavy brass handle of his hunting knife, steeping them in boiling water until the cabin smelled intensely of sharp earth and ancient medicine. He knelt beside the bed. "Drink," he coaxed, his voice dropping to a softer timbre she had never heard him use. He slipped his arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her with infinite care. The heat radiating from her skin was terrifying. A furnace in the freezing room, but his hold was cool, solid, and grounding. She drank the bitter tea, her chapped lips brushing against the edge of the tin cup. When she pushed the cup away, he did not retreat. He stayed. He dipped a clean strip of cotton into a basin of cold water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to her burning forehead. Over and over through the endless night, he repeated the motion, washing away the heat, tending the fire, keeping the creeping shadows at bay. He watched the harsh lines of her exhausted face, a face that had asked for nothing but a fair bargain, a face that had stood beside him in the freezing mud without flinching. His thumb, rough as sandstone, brushed a damp stray curl away from her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her simply to touch her. The contact was heavy with the weight of everything they had not said. He left his hand there, in his thumb resting lightly against her jaw, anchoring her to the waking world. Sometime near dawn, the wind finally died. The sudden silence was heavier than the storm. The fire in the stove had burned down to a dull cherry-red glow. Cora opened her eyes. The crushing weight on her chest was gone. The fever had broken. She turned her head slowly on the ticking mattress. Taza was still sitting in the chair beside her. He was leaning
Your hands
forward,
tell the
his
story of your
forearms
hard work.
resting on his
Every
knees,
callus,
his
every
broad
red knuckle,
shoulders
a mark
slumped
of
in
your strength and
absolute
resilience.
exhaustion.
I
But his
see the
eyes
effort
were
in
open
every
and they
line
were
and
fixed
scar.
entirely on
Thank
her.
you for all you do.
The stark practical distance that had defined their arrangement was gone, burned away by the fever, and washed clean by the night's quiet desperation. He looked at her not as a keeper of his hearth, but as a piece of his own soul. "The storm is over," he said quietly. Cora looked at his exhausted, handsome face, at the quiet devotion etched into his posture.
The winter will be harsh.
"Yes,"
We need to
she
prepare.
whispered, her voice
The
faint
land
but
provides,
perfectly
but we
clear.
must be wise.
It is. The end of winter did not
knowledge
come
is
with a
our
sudden
hope.
triumphant sunrise.
Together, we
it came as a
endure.
slow weeping thaw. It began with the rhythmic, steady drip of water falling from the heavy cedar eaves, hollowing out small craters in the snowbanks, piled high against the cabin walls. The bitter howling winds that had battered the valley for months finally exhausted themselves, replaced by a gentle southern breeze that carried the sharp, clean scent of wet pine needles and thawing black earth. Inside the cabin, the heavy iron door of the stove was left open to the morning room, the fire banked low and lazily smoking. The suffocating tension of sheer survival had broken, leaving behind a profound, settling peace. The space that had once felt stark and unforgiving now felt like a sanctuary seasoned by the smoke of 100 shared fires and the quiet, steady rhythm of 2 lives breathing in unison. Cora stood by the small window, pushing the heavy wooden shutter wide open for the first time since the deep freeze had locked them in. The light that poured over the rough floorboards was no longer the pale, hostile glare of winter. It was rich, golden, and heavy with the promise of life. Down by the creek, the thick ice had fractured, and the water ran fast and loud, a silver ribbon cutting through the lingering patches of white. The horses were out in the corral, their thick winter coats shedding in ragged patches, standing perfectly still with their faces turned toward the warming sun. Behind her, she heard the familiar soft tread of Taza's moccasins against the floorboards. She did not need to turn to know exactly where he was. The frantic, terrifying nights of her fever had stripped away the last veils of their pragmatic arrangement. He had seen her at her weakest, and she had felt the absolute, unyielding anchor of his care. They had crossed a wilderness far more dangerous than the physical distance between Bitter Creek and this hidden valley. They had navigated the silent, treacherous terrain of trust. Taza stepped up beside her. He held 2 blackened tin cups, the steam rising from the dark liquid in curling, fragrant wisps. He offered one to her without a word. Cora reached out. As her fingers wrapped around the warm metal, her knuckles brushed against his. Neither of them pulled away. The contact was brief, but it held the steady, deliberate weight of a promise. She brought the bitter coffee to her lips, letting the comforting heat spread deep into her chest. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the waking valley. The silence between them was no longer the vast, indifferent emptiness of the frontier. It was a shared language, rich, warm, and entirely complete. "The snow in the high pass has melted," Taza said, his voice a low, resonant murmur beneath the distant sound of the rushing creek. He did not look at her, keeping his dark eyes fixed on the jagged pine-covered peaks. "The trail down to the flatlands is clear. The stagecoach will be running through Bitter Creek by the end of the week." Cora took another slow sip of her coffee. She traced the rim of the tin cup with her thumb, feeling the small dents and imperfections in the battered metal. She thought of the dusty, cruel town she had left behind. She thought of the empty, desperate feeling of having nowhere to belong. Then she looked down at her hands. They were still heavily calloused. They still bore the small, fading scratches of a hard, unforgiving winter. But they were no longer trembling with uncertainty. They were steady. She turned her head, looking up at the man standing beside her. She looked at the harsh, handsome angles of his face, softened by the morning light, at the pale scar cutting through his eyebrow, and the quiet, fierce devotion living in the depths of his eyes. "Is there flour needed from the mercantile?" Cora asked, her voice perfectly even. Taza slowly turned to meet her gaze. The stoic, impenetrable mask he wore for the rest of the world was entirely absent. "No," he answered softly, the single syllable carrying a tremor of quiet hope. "The stores are full. The winter hunt was good." "Then I have no business on that trail," Cora said. She stepped closer, closing the final inch of physical distance between them. She rested her free hand lightly against the rough canvas of his shirt, feeling the slow, powerful, and steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. Taza let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that carried the release of 1,000 unspoken fears. He raised his hand, his rough, scarred fingers gently catching a loose strand of her hair, tucking it behind her ear with a reverence that took her breath away. They had bargained for survival. They had traded labor for shelter and duty for protection. But as the morning sun climbed above the canyon walls, flooding their valley with brilliant light, they both knew the bargain was dead. In its place stood something unbreakable, forged in the deep snow and the quiet fires of the frontier. They had simply undeniably become home. As we leave Cora and Taza to the quiet, hard-won peace of their hidden valley, we are reminded that the deepest bonds are rarely born from grand, sweeping declarations. Often true devotion is found in the simple, steady act of staying when the winter comes. It makes one wonder about the nature of love and whether the fires built slowly against the dark are the ones that burn the longest. We would be truly honored to hear your thoughts on this. How do you feel about Cora and Taza's unspoken romance and the practical choices they made for survival? Please share your reflections in the comments below and let us know what kind of frontier stories you would like to explore next.